All right, so let me start. Hello, good afternoon. Today, our guest is Jeff Deist, and Jeff is the president of the Mises Institute. And today, we're going to be talking about the language rewards, ESG goals, and the objective of the Mises Institute. Hello, President Jeff. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Lipton. How are you?
I am great to President Jeff, but usually on this show, I have a very personal relationship with my audience. So listeners, we should have started at 12:30, but I had some Zoom problem, and this is why we're starting at over 1. So that's just me, Jeff. I have a very intimate relationship with my listeners, and I don't like to be wait, and sorry for wasting your time. So we're going to get to business. So Jeff, what's an ESG goal? Recently, you wrote an article on stakeholder capitalism, and it was quite critical of ESG goals. What are ESG goals?
Well, technically, they stand for environmental, social, and governance goals within a corporation, usually a publicly held corporation, which has shareholders, but sometimes also a private corporation, which is seeking loans or seeking investors in private markets. So the idea is that the business is not only concerned with its customers or whatever good or service it provides, but it ought to be concerned with these larger societal goals. Like, are they doing any environmental harm, or are they offsetting carbon emissions, for example? Are they doing socially beneficial things, meaning social justice? That's the S. And as far as governance goes, that generally means is the company, its management, and its board of directors thinking about all kinds of things like diversity and inclusion and equity and hiring women and minorities and other things in how it conducts its own internal governance, either the board or the management. So all of these things are big departures from what we used to think of as the goals of a company. We used to think that the people involved with the company were the shareholders, the management, the employees, and the customers. But now, in this era of woke capitalism, we have this whole new requirement to consider environmental, social, and governance goals in how people operate what ought to be capitalist firms. So I think this is absolute nonsense. And I think it all stems from a misguided perception that because you and I would argue that profits in and of themselves are socially beneficial. But a lot of our friends on the left just disagree with that.
President Jeff, recently I was thinking about corporate social responsibility, and this idea dovetails nicely with ESG goals. If board members or CEOs are interested in philanthropy, that's great. I don't have a problem with philanthropy.
Sure.
However, we ought not to discount the impact of value creation. So Austrian economists like to talk about value. And when you start on a business that's successful, you create value for shareholders and the broader society. It's just like innovation. So I would prefer for entrepreneurs to invest their savings and resources to create future value than to invest in a charity. Because from a cost benefit analysis, investing in future value will create more wealth for people, more opportunities, and it might even minimize the need for charities. So
Well,
corporate social
sure.
responsibility, is it a positive or a negative?
Well, only individuals um, can be charitable, in my view. You're never being charitable with other people's money. I wouldn't call that charity, but uh, clearly we want businesses, especially corporations in whatever country, we don't want them polluting or harming the environment. We all have an interest in that, but we have a mechanism for that, which is lawsuits and damages against those kinds of businesses or firms or corporations. The social goals of a business ought to be, in my view, to make profit. I believe that profit is socially beneficial in the sense that profit is an indication that what you're doing works. And it also allows you to accumulate capital, invest more into a business. Businesses which are losing money don't accumulate capital and invest in capital expenditure. So you have to have profit to invest more money in the business to become more productive. And as you mentioned, that makes across the whole society, that makes us all wealthier. and so better off as a result. But from a left perspective, the goal isn't just how much total, to understand how to make more total wealth in society, but how to divvy it up and to ensure that it is distributed fairly. I think this idea that we need to distribute wealth evenly or fairly is actually pretty harmful. I think it distorts the economy, causes a lot of wealth not to come into existence, and now it's become this political mania. Like social justice, for example, we used to think that that was the purview of, Lipton, let's say political activists or academics or people involved in the nonprofit world. But now it is very much, apparently, also the business of corporations. So that's a real change.
Jeff, how important is capital formation for the success of a business? Because these days, with the obsession with ESG goals, charity, and wokeness, other than the Mises Institute and a few other dissident economists, I rarely hear people talking about capital formation.
Yeah, it's so important because we become sometimes so wealthy in the West that we don't understand how we got wealthy, and we don't understand how we might mess it up, and we don't understand what if it all went away. And so we can't just create capital through central bank or fiscal policy at the government level. That's not real capital. That's money. Money and credit are not the same thing as capital. Capital has to be earned and created by making more than you spend, either on an individual level, family level, business level, whatever it might be. And that's generally hard work. And so capital is usually near and dear to people. And so borrowing capital from other people usually comes at a price. We call that interest. So, we've learned through hundreds and hundreds of years of, we could say that modern capitalism in some ways has its origins in the medieval period. We've learned through many hundreds of years that capital accumulation and formation allows a society, an economy, a country to get wealthier and to provide more goods and services more efficiently, more cheaply, more productively, which makes a lot of things that used to be luxuries, like flying on an airplane or owning an automobile, far more available to common people now, people like you and me. So this idea that we're so rich, Lipton, that all we have to do is worry about fairness and equity is just absolute nonsense. America, for example, could lose its wealth. There's nothing guaranteed.
And the wealth requires both human capital and social capital. So in a recent, you noted that if you are an aggressive individual, you burn social capital. So Jeff, these companies that promote wokeness and ESG goals, are they burning social capital? Because if you're telling me that if I am skeptical of the COVID vaccine, I can't do business with your platform, then you're burning social capital.
Well, I think that's true. In other words, if a company takes public stances, especially a big public company, a Google, a Microsoft, a Nike, if they take big public stances in their advertisements, in their social media that appear to people like me anyway, to be favoring left-wing causes, then it's possible that as a consumer or as an investor, I will be turned off, and that people who view the world like me represent some percentage of the population. And so the Nikes or the Googles or the Apples or the Microsofts are actually going to hurt their bottom line because they're turning off some customers. That's certainly possible and certainly somewhat true. The flip side is that the people who are on the boards of these publicly traded companies or in management of these companies feel like, well, we don't care about the Jeffs of the world. In the long run, the world is heading in a certain direction. We can call that woke or progressive or socially just or whatever we want to call it. And that in the long run, we want to be on the right side of this, both because we see that, in moral terms, but also because we see that there will be economic benefits to being a company that's viewed favorably by more people in the long run. So I'm not sure that everything so-called woke companies do is simply out of the goodness of their hearts. I think that they imagine that in the long term, anyway, it's in their best interest, even if in the short term it costs them some customers or some investors.
There's a writer called Vincent Harinam. He did a study on the topic. He was exploring the extent to which wokeness affects the profitability of companies. And he basically concluded by saying companies don't need to be woke. The gains are at best marginal. So even if they think that they're going to make money, they're really wasting time because it's not difficult to identify a fad from a long-term trend.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're obsessed with wokeness, but next 10 or 20 years ago, it could just be a fad. We don't know. You never know.
That's true. A friend of mine recently said ESG will fall out of favor because it doesn't work. For example, investment funds which put too much faith into ESG will not perform as well as other funds, and therefore the market will take care of this. And I understand that argument, but the flip side is look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't work,
No.
but it lasted for 70 years and caused unbelievable misery. And even today, Russia and the former Eastern Bloc countries are appreciably poorer than Western Europe, even though it's been several decades now since the fall of the Soviet rule. So, when you talk about capital formation, time is of the essence. In a sense, capital compounds over time. So any capital we're not creating today because we're worried about ESG, for example, or any money we're wasting today, that means that future generations are going to be poorer as a result because of the wealth that never comes into being because we wasted some money now. Just like, if you and I decide to go out to dinner tonight, and that costs us more than eating at home. And as a result, 30, 40, 50 years from now, that $25 or $20 or whatever we spent, we could have put into some sort of investment. Well, that would be a cost down the road. It's the same thing with ESG. I'm not convinced that it's going to go away anytime soon. I think it's actually growing in power.
2 points. So first, I'm going to talk about eating dinner outside of home, and secondly, I'm going to talk about ESG goals. Well, if we decide to have dinner at a fancy restaurant, that's actually good. Remember, the economy should improve our utility. So if I spend $100 or 2 grand on nice food, and as a result, I feel better, then the economy is working for us.
Well, 2 grand, you better feel a lot better.
Yeah, so as Austrians, that's how we view the economy. The economy works when our utility is being enhanced.
But it also works in the sense that the restaurant gets your 2,000 and is able to be more productive. The problem with the spending mindset, the consumer mindset, and this is really at the core of the problem with economics today as a profession, is that really not necessarily since Marx, but certainly since John Maynard Keynes and other neoclassicals of the 20th century, we have decided that the way you create a healthy economy and a growing economy is through stimulating consumption. And that generally means easier and cheaper money and debt, whether that's on the monetary policy side or the fiscal policy side. So we have decided that consumption is the measure of a healthy economy. Well, that's backwards, of course, because production is the benchmark of a healthy economy. You can't consume anything that hasn't been produced first. This is, Say's law, the famous French economist Jean-Baptiste Say, basically said that your work, your productivity, what you produce as an individual, that creates the marketplace for that creates your ability to go buy, because that creates an income or some productivity for you. So the idea that production creates its own supply, creates its own demand, is sort of a very roundabout way of restating Say's law. So today we seem to have it backwards. We seem to think, well, all you got to do is make people want to buy more stuff, and they already want lots of stuff. Everybody wants, I don't know, a fancy car or something. But in order to help them buy more stuff and satisfy those wants, let's make interest rates really low. Let's give them all stimulus checks from the government during COVID, whatever it might be, designed to keep them spending. And I would argue that that's an error and that's a distortion. And so, although, as you point out, if I feel better off spending some, crazy amount of money for some really fancy meal, then there's nothing uneconomic about that. That's absolutely fine. But is the reason I'm feeling that way because, let's say, I have a very low interest credit card or something like that? Well, then, we get into this question of whether my demand for that fancy meal is actually at least slightly artificial.
No, so perfect example. When I was a student in high school, I said to a friend, after graduating, when we're adults, I want to eat out at fancy restaurants. Now, how did I get to eat at fancy restaurants? Well, I had to work really hard in school. I had to invest in social relationships. I had to meet professionals like yourself to eat at a fancy restaurant. So me eating at a fancy restaurant is actually my reward for years of patience. When other people were on Facebook, I was busy reading some 600-page book to write articles. So it all works out in the end.
Well, I'm glad to hear it.
Yes, it's not easy to be a writer. It's a lot of reading, and some people are difficult to comprehend, especially when they're deceased. So somebody like Ludwig von Mises, he was writing a different era. The writing style is different. So to read someone like Mises and digest him, one needs patience. And back to our point about ESG goals, there's an article published by City Journal titled "The ESG Bubble is Bursting," and the writer makes the obvious point: ESG funds are underperforming, and this statement is hyperlinked. So if you wish, you can go and look up the data. But yes, ESG funds are not doing well.
Well, that's interesting to hear. I will go look that article up, and I hope they're right. I like a lot of the people at City Journal. Do you recall the name of the author?
Yes, let me look at his name again. His name is, oh, it's a girl, it's a lady. I know her, Alison Schrager. Yes, Alison. I read her every now and then.
Okay.
So she's the one positing this argument. But Jeff, I find it quite shocking that in the Austrian school, more people are not writing about OnlyFans. So I'm interested in OnlyFans because to the average person, sex videos are not valuable. But people are willing to pay to watch other people have sex and do crazy stuff. So I said to myself, how do we really define value? Yes, it is subjective, but for subjective value to be valuable, it has to be objectively good for some people. So even in the context of subjective value, there is still some objectivity. It's just like Petrock, that company Petrock. Some people don't like toys, but the fact that the creator of Petrock became a multi-millionaire suggests that he created value for many people. So the objectivity subjectivity dichotomy, if you look at it carefully, it's really complicated. Because
absolutely.
yes, on one level, I don't need Petrock. Petrock is not valuable, but for thousands of people, they get great joy by investing in Petrock. So obviously some value was created, and it's objective because it made some people better off. So can value really be subjective?
Well, absolutely, value is subjective. The pet rock, I would argue, is different than, let's say, porn.
Yes.
As a market, because the pet rock was sort of a psychological phenomenon where this cute idea came out and a bunch of people thought it was funny, and it was probably discussed at parties, and so people had it for a while, but it didn't last. No one's buying a pet rock today. Whereas sex, nudity, online porn, these are durable markets. Prostitution, these markets are as old as humankind. And so there's a huge human drive towards sex. And so, Mises wrote about this. He said, well, what about when we don't approve of how, let's say, an average guy spends his leisure time and money? He wrote about this in the Anti-Capitalistic Mentality, 1944. He said, well, we could say Shakespeare and, Bach are more beautiful and higher tone than Mickey Spillane books and the current, whatever music of that ragtime music or whatever of his time, that we ought to be encouraging people to aspire to these loftier cultural things or something. And he said, well, okay, but first of all, the the more quality art and cultural and subjective aesthetic tastes, sensibilities tend to win out in the long run. And there's probably some truth that we're still reading Shakespeare. I'm sure some kids in high school wish we weren't. And we probably won't be reading, what's pop reading today. I don't know.
50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, 50 Shades of Grey. We probably won't be reading that in 200 years. And then as far as pornography, I mean, it certainly has socially undesirable consequences. So the value of it is subjective on the individual level. And so we know that prohibition has its own costs. So I think it just comes down to one of those things where, as you say, it's complicated. There's lots of things where our subjective determination of whether we, eating too much, sugar, drinking too much alcohol, smoking too much tobacco, any of these things can be harmful for us in the long term if, over a long period, but they satisfy something in the short term. So, I think that's where any sort of sexual content or whatever, I think that's the way you look at it as economists. And looking at it as economists or from an economic lens is 100% different than looking at it from the lens of your priest or whatever. The economics of it are different than the values and the morality of it, two different things. But I do think Mises was correct in that it's not really the economist's place to judge the aesthetic sensibilities of consumers.
And I agree with him. So these days, I have been rethinking the notion of income inequality for several reasons. If we live in a world where even mundane ideas and practices are being monetized, to what extent should we really care about income inequality? So Mr. Beast is a millionaire YouTuber, but we could survive without his videos. So if any random person can go on YouTube or write a badly written book and make serious money, to what extent should we really care about income inequality? Because what people fail to appreciate, Jeff, is that we actually have great literature on the topic. There's a positive relationship between economic complexity and wealth creation and job creation. So as an economy matures, it's easier for people to create wealth. So if it's easier for us to create wealth and people like Mr. Beast are making millions, why should we still care about income inequality?
What's this guy's name, Mr. What?
Beast. Yeah, he makes serious money.
Oh, okay. Well, look, this goes back to the diamond water paradox, which the subjectivists finally solved in the 1800s, which is, why does this guy make so much money monetizing his YouTubes? Apparently he must get millions of views. Why does he make so much more money than the noble farmer, who's producing food that we actually need that will literally die without if we don't get calories? Well, that's because calories, for the moment anyway, and water and other things are plentiful and pretty cheap relative to diamonds. And so, we don't pay as much for them. But if we were dying of thirst in the desert, we would give all the diamonds on, let's say we had a diamond watch or something, we would gladly give that up for a single cup of water. And that diamond watch, under those subjective circumstances, that diamond encrusted watch would be worth far less to us than just 1 ounce of, a thumbleful of water. So this is late stage capitalism. I don't know anything about this YouTuber, but maybe it's mindless stuff. And, but with economies of scale, and the digital world created economies of scale, this is what happens. Some guy like him gets rich.
Yeah, but well, I am going to be a bit cheeky just for about 2 seconds. So some of the people who complain about capitalism and income inequality, they write for magazines or newspapers, whatever, like the Atlantic and the New York Times. Interestingly, when I was a teenager, I used to read those papers frequently, not so much anymore. So they complain about income inequality and they are able to identify all the problems wrong with capitalism, but they have benefited from capitalism because value is subjective. So the New York Times, I look at the New York Times every now and then. I think Thomas Edsall is really smart. The Atlantic has some interesting people, but I think that people like Paul Gottfried and David Gordon are way smarter than most of these writers, and they're not as famous. So
Sure.
maybe leftists should be happy that they're getting money that they deserve because of the market, but that they don't really deserve based on the quality of what they write. When I read New York Times,
Yeah,
I go to sleep.
absolutely.
I don't. Exactly. David Gordon, the philosopher, and Paul Godfrey, they're way smarter than many of these guys and women who write for New York Times and other mainstream publications.
Well, and there's probably all kinds of classically trained musicians who are more skilled than a lot of the pop stars of today, but the pop stars are making way more money. So again, it's subjective. It's the nature of the universe. But the digital world has really boosted this. It's changed the way things scale. And I do think that what we call income or wealth inequality, it's actually a misnomer, because how many zeros you have in your bank account don't matter as much as how you live day to day. And my day-to-day life is more like Bill Gates than unlike. I'm sure he's got a fancier house, fancier car, but he gets up and drives to an office and looks at his computer most of the day. Now, he has certain benefits I don't have. He probably has his own private doctor on call. He probably has his own private plane so he can fly around. But I mean, if we, in an era of what I would consider distorted wealth due to central banks, the number of zeros in your bank account is not so much the measure, or inequality is not what we ought to be looking at. What we ought to be looking at is how are average people able to live within a society. That ought to be our focus, not on how rich the super rich are.
And average people have been doing quite well. Tourism was once a luxury for the elite. The cellular phone was once a luxury for the elite. Today in Jamaica, Jamaica is classified as an upper middle income country, but it has a poverty problem. And even if you go into inner cities or relatively poor schools, you see children with their computers and their tablets. And when you go to restaurants, you see people who are not earning millions eating quality food. So
Mm-hmm.
that's my concern. So people like to talk about income inequality in Jamaica, but poverty decline in the context of rising inequality.
Sure. This was Margaret Thatcher's point. We ought to be concerned with how the poorest people are doing, not how the wealthiest are doing. And so it's really a red herring. All this talk about inequality, it's just designed to create emotional attraction to left-wing policies, which can make everybody poorer in the long run. So would we want, if we ask a progressive in the West, would you be okay with less total wealth in society? And, let's say a given country, given community, whatever it might be, in exchange for having that wealth more equally divided, I think a lot of progressives would say yes. I think a lot of them would say, yeah, we're rich enough. What matters far more now is how we share that wealth. And of course, the problem with that is that if we really started sharing it equally, the incentive structures to get rich would go away, and we'd find ourselves getting much poorer much faster.
Well, Jeff, I am laughing because it's so ironic that income in people who often tout anti progress measures are often highly educated, articulate, and beautiful. And beauty is a major predictor of winning an election, getting funding from a venture capitalist, being cited, and just living a successful life. People like pretty people. So many of these elites who tout policies to lower income inequality are beautiful people. So why don't they
Yes.
tax beauty? Why don't they tax beauty?
Well, yeah. Looks, charm, charisma, intelligence, all these things are unequally distributed by nature, by Mother Nature or God or a creator, however you view the world. So I guess the question becomes, how do you correct that if you're a progressive? And so far, we haven't seen any suggestions for that outside of dystopian novels. But yeah, I think your point's well taken. There are lots of different ways to measure wealth, and physical beauty is one of them.
No, but seriously, beauty is a robust predictor of success in life. We have many studies on the topic. Beautiful people, on average, they do better. They're happier. People want to be their friends. And it's difficult to tax beauty, but many of these leftists today, they propose ideas that are quite outrageous. They want us to deindustrialize in order to tame climate change when the climate is always changing. There's little we can really do to avert climate change. So if they're so passionate about income inequality, why not manage beauty?
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, conceptually, they ought to support both to be consistent, but consistency is not always a virtue in politics.
Jeff, recently you penned an article on the language wars. What's that? What are you talking about?
Well, language is an institution. We don't think of it that way. We tend to think of it as a tool for communication or a tool for cognition, like a hammer. I say, "Hey, I'd like that sandwich," and I say that to a cashier. We think, well, that's just a tool. You're using words like a hammer. But actually, if you dial back a bit, language is an institution. And so, like all of our institutions, it's under attack by people who would like to capture it, people who would like to control it, and people who would like to use it to shape the words we use for their own political goals. And so, over time, language naturally evolves. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why we don't go around speaking Middle English. And that's why we have acronyms that emerge spontaneously. That's why we have all kinds of slang and meme culture, all of which emerge spontaneously. But there's also a lot of changes to our language which have not been spontaneous. And I would argue that these are imposed from the top down by political, cultural, social, academic, media elites. And it's not very subtle. They want to shape our words so that we shape our thinking and ultimately even our actions. So when we start to use the term cis, for example, to represent, I guess, a heterosexual person, that changes our thinking because it creates a new category which has to be explained, something that heretofore never had to be explained. When we use the word equity instead of equality, Americans anyway, we like to pat ourselves on the back, but Americans thought we had a good understanding of equality as a term meaning equality under the law, which means rich people and poor people shouldn't be treated differently by the state, especially by the courts. But that was never the same thing as equity, which has now been redefined to mean a very generalized, overbroad fairness. And if Kamala Harris is to be believed, as she discussed during her vice presidential campaign, equity means that we all end up in the same place. In other words, it's a term used to denote equality of outcome. And in America, the idea that the right to seek happiness was always to go out there and find it, as opposed to have the same outcomes among people. So these not so subtle shifts in our language, using terms like equity, I argue are conscious, and they're designed to change our thinking. And so I think we ought to be careful about letting the left control language like it seems to control so many other institutions.
It's just like social justice. Social justice is injustice, and more than likely you would have seen some of my pieces on the topic. But economic freedom promotes social justice and economic equality. Economically free societies are actually more equal than static societies. Individualistic societies are more equal than collectivistic societies,
Sure.
and usually less corrupt. So social justice is social injustice, and based on how the free market is structured, if we're being logical, the free market even rewards lazy people, because the new people like Luis de Molina and other of the neo-scholastics, many of these men, when they wrote, they were lobbying for policies to benefit the truly poor individuals who were poor due to no fault of their own. They weren't talking about idlers. So people who would drop out of school and refuse to work. So when we say Christianity blesses the poor, usually we're talking about individuals who need our assistance. So you're crippled or you were born poor, and as such it's harder for you to get rich. We're not talking about idlers, but capitalist economies benefit people who don't like to work. Look at the welfare system. The welfare state gets money from productive people. So if you're a beneficiary of welfare in a capitalist society and you literally choose to not work, that's injustice because capitalism is rewarding people who are lazy. So the social justice that capitalism delivers is actually superior to the social justice that socialism would deliver.
Well, certainly capitalist market societies are wealthier and make everybody better off and tend to be more, I guess, more just or democratic in the sense that they don't have this oligarchical, or they shouldn't have this oligarchical ruling class. And of course, justice is individual by definition. Hayek wrote The Mirage of Social Justice to say, when you try to create equality, you end up treating people unequally. And the whole reason that we want justice to be blind, there's a reason why the Statue of Liberty has the blindfold over her face, is because she's not supposed to be looking at let's say, the criminal defendant based on his or her identity. It's supposed to be the courts of justice are supposed to apply the law in a neutral manner, regardless to whether this is a rich or poor person, for example. So the idea that we need to create justice in a broad social way, taking an individualized concept and trying to apply it to groups, it's just not unworkable. But more importantly, once again, it's a happy clappy term which is being used to weaponize policies, left-wing policies against us. So social justice, far from being some sort of benign or well-intentioned movement, is actually quite sinister.
Just like gender quotas, if you believe in gender quota, you're depriving qualified men of a job, and you're also rewarding men who call themselves women. So trans women can also benefit from gender quota. So yes, you're distorting the free market that's fairer than socialism, and you're putting undue pressure on people who usually work hard to work twice as hard. It's just like in Canada where where people are being selected to benefit from grants on the basis of diversity, like their orientation or their skin color. So men and women who work really, really hard, they're less likely to get these grants. So you're disadvantaging quality people for individuals who might not be as successful or as competent.
Well, certainly we see this across the economy. This desire to treat everybody based on identity, and to think that all people who share certain physical characteristics are fungible tokens, it is very, very dangerous. And I hope we put an end to this in the U.S.
I think so too. Well, Jeff, so I have a new article coming out from Mises where I argue that people are migrating to America because America is a successful country. So when I look at the TV and I see those men and women risking their lives to get into America, I say the American dream still exists. The moment when migrants from Honduras and Mexico are refusing to enter America, you know that America is failing. So yes, the inability to control the border is a major crisis. But if people weren't crossing the border to get into America, that would be a problem because it would literally mean that America is no longer the epitome of success.
Well, yeah, I hope people still want to come here. I'm not. I'm at this point with our IRS. I'm not sure that I would wish American citizenship on anybody. But look, in many ways, America is still a relatively capitalist economy and a relative bright spot in the world. So, but my fear is that we have lost sight of how we got here, and that we're going to screw it up. And that, I think, trying to help people understand what it takes to get rich and what it takes to stay rich is a very important task, because the mainstream media and the profession of economics, in my opinion, are not up to that task.
I think and Herman up is up to it because he's one of the few theoretical economists who is not afraid to write on patience. And there's a positive link between patience and the wealth of nations. That's so people, that's one way to get rich. You have to save and invest and think about the future.
Absolutely. A future orientation is critical. And when you have a democratic society where so much is decided by government and government just wants to get reelected, that tends to put policymakers in a position where they're very short-sighted. They have high time preference, which is the opposite of what we need. We need capitalists and individuals and families operating for the long term.
And because you mentioned time preference, again, people like to criticize Hop, but I have read literature. It's actually right on monarchies. Monarchies in many ways are superior to democracies. They're better at predicting property rights. They're less likely to go to war when compared to republics. They have better credit scores and they're also better than autocracies. Democracy is overrated. Economic freedom is even a better variable of predicting development than even good governance. So to these days, when I read articles with headlines like Peter Thiel once destroyed democracy, I just laugh because democracy is overrated. That's why so many philosophers don't take it seriously.
Well, sure, democracy is hugely overrated. When it comes to monarchy, it depends on the monarch. I'm not so sure that King Charles III, as we're calling him, obviously he's not a real monarch. He's more of a symbolic monarch. But nonetheless, I'm not sure I have as much faith in him. But there are, again, mostly ceremonial, but also monarchs with some power, like Hans Adam II in Liechtenstein, who I think is very much a benevolent monarch. Now, that's a very tiny, wealthy country of about 77,000 people, so it's not necessarily the best analogy. But I mean, it's clear that I think Hoppe's main point about democracy serving high time preference versus monarchy, at least potentially, creating the incentive for the monarch or the monarchical family to preserve the capital stock or increase the capital stock of the country. I think that's true, and I think it's worth considering. I'm just not sure if we have anybody up to the task of actually being a halfway decent monarch in the West today.
But Hop is not a monarchist. He just thinks that it is superior to democracy, which is really inferior. Right. And again, I must say this. So some people have caricaturized Hop, but the literature supporting the idea is quite overwhelming. There is even a paper on the benefits of hereditary rule. So hereditary rulers are more likely to promote long-term orientation. So the theoretical premise of Hop is not inaccurate.
I agree completely.
So I'm wrapping up, but before I wrap up, question for you. Have you ever been to Jamaica?
You know, this is embarrassing. I have as a kid, but it was on a cruise ship.
On a cruise ship?
Yep. With my parents.
Okay, with your parents.
A long time ago.
A long time ago. Well, Jamaica is so famous, but I find it so strange that so many of my guests have never visited.
Well, at least I have.
Yeah, but a long time ago. But so the cost of living in Jamaica is relatively inexpensive. So I am encouraging people in the States to retire in developing countries like Jamaica.
Or work from home in developing countries.
Yes, you can, but you can also retire in Jamaica. I'm promoting Jamaica as a retirement destination for foreigners.
I'll yes. Make a note of that. They're going to put me out to pasture very soon at the Mises Institute. So
no, you still look quite young. You could tell me that you're 45.
Okay.
But yes, thanks for showing up. You're a busy guy, so I really appreciate
Thank you, Lipton.
your time.
Okay.
And yeah, so all right then. Thanks for showing up again. Bye.
Bye now.